I froze when my wife moved tables to sit with a strange man at the couple's dinner, and the entire room seemed to spin around me. I remained silent out of self-respect, but I knew right then and there that our bond had been broken. That same night, I left the ring on the table and left. She tried to explain later, but it was too late. The man, as expected, disappeared soon after getting what he wanted, leaving her alone with the void she herself created. I moved on, and in due time, I found a new love, someone who looked at me truthfully and walked beside me loyally. Years later, she sought me out seeking redemption. I offered what my heart already had, forgiveness. But I made it clear that forgiveness closes cycles, it doesn't mend knots. Each of us followed our own path, and she understood the weight of her choice. But not that night. That night was the beginning of the end. The kind of end that doesn't come with screams or violence, but with the suffocating silence of a betrayal that doesn't need explaining, because what hurt wasn't the stolen kiss, nor the hidden touch, nor the desire disguised between smiles. What hurt was the coldness with which she looked at me before leaving our table. What hurt was the look she gave the other man, full of a youthful curiosity that no longer existed between us. What tore at my heart was the sound of her heels going in another direction, as if I had never been her choice. As if all our years together were nothing more than a whim overcome by boredom. I didn't make a fuss. I just watched her go. And I never went back to that place. In the car, with the steering wheel between my hands, I could still hear the sound of glasses clinking in the back of my mind. My stomach churned, not with anger, but with a sadness so deep it seemed to consume me from the inside out. That night, the house was dark when I arrived. The ring still gleamed on my finger as I climbed the stairs, but its weight wasn't gold, it was shame. I removed it like ripping out an open wound. And I left it there, on the kitchen table, where she always left love notes in our early years. Now, there was only silence and the certainty that her love no longer lived there. She called me. Many times. She sent desperate messages the next day. She showed up at work saying she wanted to talk. She cried. She asked for forgiveness. She said it was an impulse, that she didn't know why she did it. That it was just a conversation, an innocent flirtation, a small mistake. But there's no such thing as a small mistake when what's broken is trust. I listened to her in silence, just as I'd been silent the night before. Because there are times when speech loses its meaning. And I knew that if I said a word, I'd scream. And I didn't want to scream at someone who had once been my peace. She stayed. And then he was gone. Like every lover, he promised nothing. And she, in the foolish fantasy of experiencing something new, threw away everything that was true. She traded a time-tested love for a fleeting thrill. The kind of man who speaks beautifully at dinner but doesn't know where you keep your pain. And when the charm wore off, he vanished. Like smoke. Like cheap perfume after a party. And she stood there, empty glass in hand, wondering how she got to this point. The answer came too late. The truth is, she didn't cheat on me with another man. She cheated on me with the illusion of being desired again. She wasn't in love with him, but with the reflection of herself in his eyes. And I, who knew her through thick and thin, no longer offered the sparkle of novelty. I offered security, loyalty, presence. But sometimes that's not enough for those who want adrenaline, not depth. Time passed. And it was cruel to her. Because nothing is crueler than the memory of a sincere love that you destroyed with your own hands. While she deleted photos, I made new ones. While she returned to an empty house, I began to build another with someone who saw me through eyes she no longer used. And the irony of life is that, when she realized what she had lost, there was no way back. Because I was no longer the man who cried inside. I was the man who had learned to smile again. And even after everything, when she reached out to me, not with pride, but with humility, I wasn't cruel. I didn't throw in her face the messages she'd sent him while we were together. I didn't reminisce about the way she smiled differently, as if I weren't there anymore. I wasn't petty like she was. I just took a deep breath and said, "I forgive you. But I don't want you back." She cried. Not with anger, but with regret. And it was then that I realized the greatest irony of all: she had never been betrayed. But she had ended up being deceived by someone who promised nothing. And I, who had been betrayed by someone who promised everything, was the one who left with my heart whole. She wanted to come back because she realized that no kiss can replace a love built with patience. That no new thing is worth more than the hand that welcomes you in pain. That no one-night stand compares to the comfortable silence of someone who truly knows you. But the love she destroyed, was no longer there. He was somewhere else. In another heart. In another story that began at the right time, with someone who never made me doubt my worth. Someone who chose me every day, even on the hard days. Someone who saw me broken and decided to rebuild with me, without rushing. And that's why I say, forgiveness isn't about going back to the way things were. It's about acknowledging what was, understanding what was lost, and moving forward in peace. The strangest thing of all is that, years later, when I no longer thought about her, I discovered that the man she'd left me for had started dating an old rival of hers. A woman she hated. Who she despised. Who she called shallow, futile, and devoid of essence. And there, she realized that she'd not only lost me, but had become someone she no longer even respected. And what she did when she found out about this, well, this, you have to listen to the end to find out. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal isn't romanticized or justified, it's exposed. All the stories are fictional, but the feelings are real. Our goal is to show, unfiltered, how betrayal destroys homes, hearts, and entire lives. Get ready. What you're about to hear is an intense, painful, and unforgettable story. Let the regrets begin. They seemed made for each other. To outsiders, there was something between them reminiscent of old-fashioned romances, the kind that endures time, wear, and the harsh winds. Daniel was a discreet man, with a low voice and a firm presence. He had a calm way of listening to people, as if he truly cared about every word spoken, and perhaps that was what captivated him most about his personality, the way he remained whole where others merely passed by. Clara, on the other hand, was a light. Charismatic, spontaneous, intense. She arrived anywhere with a wide smile and an almost magnetic confidence. She had something in her gaze that oscillated between challenge and charm, and this contrast was precisely what captivated Daniel from their first meeting, during a university lecture to which they were both invited by mutual friends. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, and it was, until she crossed her leg in the chair in front of her and glanced over her shoulder, giving a half-distracted, half-curious smile, as if silently asking, "Why are you looking at me?" He smiled back, and from that moment on, the paths were no longer the same. It didn't take long for them to become involved. The relationship grew at a natural but steady pace. Their conversations were long, full of meaning. Clara enjoyed talking about the world, about life's small sensations, while Daniel listened to her with that focused gaze that made her feel important. He, in turn, brought a more sober, pragmatic view of things, and perhaps that's why the two worked so well. She added color where he saw structure, and he offered ground where she longed to soar. They experienced a rare balance, a connection that, at first glance, seemed unbeatable. Over time, their courtship turned into a relationship, and their relationship into a marriage. They lived in a cozy apartment in a quiet part of the city, decorated with light tones and details that blended her good taste with his practicality. Clara worked in cultural production and was surrounded by events, artists, and vibrant environments. Daniel worked as a financial planner and preferred quiet weekends, dinners for two, and sunset strolls. Despite their differences, they had both learned to admire each other for this reason. During the first years of their marriage, their routine seemed light, built on respect and intimacy. They had simple rituals: Sunday pancake breakfasts, weeknight walks, the notes Clara left stuck on the fridge whenever she knew she would be home late. Daniel, despite his difficulty expressing affection with words, compensated with silent gestures. he made her bed with the same care every day, prepared her favorite tea on cold days, and knew exactly when she needed silence, even without saying it. It was a more restrained love, but full of layers. A love that seemed immune to the rush of the world. Still, there were signs, small, invisible movements, that gradually shifted the center of their relationship without either of them fully realizing it. Clara began spending more time away, not for lack of affection, but because her job required constant attendance at events, dinners, get-togethers, and meetings that went on beyond her usual hours. Daniel understood, or at least tried to understand, because he'd always trusted her. He wasn't the kind of man who suffocated, who demanded satisfaction every minute. He was secure enough to believe in the love they'd built, and perhaps it was precisely this security that kept him from noticing the small cracks in the wall they'd built together. On days when Clara was late, he read. On weekends when she had to travel, he took care of the house, organized the closets, made grocery lists, and followed her routine. And when she returned, tired, talkative, and full of stories, he smiled, listened, and welcomed her with open arms, because he still saw in her the same woman he'd fallen in love with. He still saw her as the partner in every plan. Clara loved him too. But her love was being tested by a new kind of discomfort, the weight of being too understood. Daniel was so stable, so serene, that sometimes she missed the unpredictable, the unexpected. She began to feel like she knew his every answer before she even asked. It wasn't his fault. It was the result of years of living together where everything seemed in place. And although this stability was the dream of many, Clara silently began to question if it was still her dream. She tried to push her thoughts away, to focus on what they had built, but the uneasiness grew, and she had no one to tell. Too many friends, too many judgments. Too much family, too much pressure. Daniel, too understanding. And most frightening, no major fights, no obvious crises, nothing concrete to justify the thoughts that, night after night, kept her awake even as she lay next to someone who had always made her feel safe. The distancing didn't come cruelly, but it did. First, in details, the quick touch instead of the lingering hug, the cell phone face down on the table, the longer silence between one comment and the next. Clara started sleeping later, saying she had a lot of work to do. Daniel noticed, but respected it. He didn't want to suffocate, and he didn't know how to ask without seeming invasive. Perhaps, deep down, he was afraid of the answer. What they had was too solid to suddenly crumble, but too fragile to withstand the absence of conversation. And the silence, yes, grew between them, while each pretended it was just tiredness, just routine, just a phase. Until that dinner. But before dinner, there were the days of preparation, the clothes shopping, the lipstick chosen with more care than usual, the glance Clara cast in the mirror as if seeking some confirmation she couldn't find in her husband's eyes. There was also the quick text exchanged with someone, the disguised touch on her cell phone, the extra 5 seconds before smiling when Daniel complimented her. And there was him, Daniel, running his hand over his shirt collar, adjusting his cuffs, trying to look more elegant than usual, unaware that day, his attempt to get closer was already a few steps behind, a distance he hadn't yet realized existed. Their arrival at the restaurant was as usual. A well-dressed, handsome, mature couple. They were warmly welcomed by friends and acquaintances. Greetings, glasses of wine, background music, laughter. But in that room full of voices, there was something between them that remained silent. Something that didn't match Clara's laughter or Daniel's serenity. And this something hovered over the table like an invisible presence. An omen. They smiled. They talked about trivialities. They masked the tension neither of them could name. The night went on, and what should have been just another social gathering, just another ordinary dinner, would long be remembered as the thin line between before and after. But what exactly happened there, that was yet to come. What led Clara to cross that line, what went through her mind and heart, what Daniel felt as he saw the decision being made before his eyes, all of this was built in the silences, in the details, in the spaces that widened without anyone noticing. And that's why, to understand the depth of that night, you need to look at what wasn't said. At the moments of silence filled with everything. At the automatic gestures, at the hugs that lost their warmth, at the kisses that no longer asked permission. Their story didn't begin with a lie. It began with love. With truth. With surrender. And perhaps that's why it hurts so much. Because some betrayals hurt, but others destroy everything believed to be eternal. And the cruelest thing of all is that, until that dinner, Daniel still believed. There was still a silent hope in him that, despite the exhaustion, despite the silence, despite the absence, she would still choose him. But some choices aren't made overnight. They're prepared slowly, like water that hurts more through repetition than intensity. And that night, something broke, though neither of them said it out loud. The fracture was subtle, but irreversible. And when it happened, there was no sound. Just the dry crack of a heart breaking from within, with no audience, no explanation. And yet, Daniel didn't scream. Because sometimes, silence is the only shield left in the face of a loss that can no longer be prevented. Dinner continued with a forced glow that seemed reflected in every glass of wine served, in every laugh that echoed between the couples around, in every conversation staged to hide the growing discomfort that invaded Daniel's eyes with each passing minute. Clara's hand rested motionless on her lap, as if avoiding any contact. Their touch, once natural, had become calculated, distant, almost formal. Still, Daniel tried to convince himself it was just a bad phase, one of those nights when fatigue speaks louder than affection, when the weight of social obligations drowns out spontaneous gestures. He watched her surreptitiously, searching in her eyes for something that would reconnect him to the woman with whom he shared his life. But there was something different there. A new glow, a subtle, almost imperceptible uneasiness, but to him, who knew her better than anyone, it sounded like a silent alarm about to go off. As her friends talked about travels and professional achievements, Clara kept her gaze moving, as if searching for someone or something that hadn't yet arrived. She didn't seem bored or uncomfortable. On the contrary, she was hyper-attentive. There was a tension in her jawline, a practiced lightness in her shoulders, as if she were trying to disguise something that wasn't yet visible but already existed. Daniel felt his stomach tighten, even though he smiled and raised his glass to the toasts that came every 15 minutes. The ambient music, the candles on the tables, the well-laid dishes, everything seemed designed to suggest a perfect evening, but Clara's imperfection before him tore through the scene like a crack in a freshly painted wall. He tried to make conversation, make inside jokes, recall little moments from the past that would normally elicit a smile from her. But Clara deflected, responding with short sentences, and quickly returned her attention to her surroundings. Then it happened. An elegant, confident-looking man with a penetrating gaze entered the restaurant and walked between the tables with the confidence of someone who knows he'll be noticed. Daniel noticed the subtle lift of Clara's chin, the way she smoothed her hair and crossed her legs, as if preparing to be seen. The man passed by and cast a brief glance in their direction, but enough to inflame the already charged atmosphere. Daniel, without understanding why, felt his blood run cold. His intuition, always silent, cried out for the first time. Dinner continued for a few more minutes, until the unthinkable happened. Clara, with a restrained smile, got up from the table and walked toward the man. Daniel watched her, unable to move. She whispered something in his ear, smiled again, and within seconds, they were seated together at another table, a few feet away. A couple who, just minutes before, had been side by side in a celebration among friends, now found themselves separated by an abyss of silent decisions. The eyes of some guests turned, discreet but present. The hostess tried to hide her discomfort, while others pretended not to notice what was happening. Daniel remained motionless. There was no anger in his expression. There was astonishment. There was pain. There was a silent pride that prevented him from chasing after her, from shouting, from demanding explanations, amid the self-assured smiles and expensive dishes. He calmly got up, grabbed his coat, straightened the buttons on his shirt, and left the restaurant without looking back. As he left, a light breeze brushed his face. He walked along the sidewalk as if floating, with the unsteady steps of someone who's just lost something they haven't yet fully grasped. There was no explosion. Only emptiness. Only the deafening silence of a certainty that no longer needed to be expressed. That woman, with whom he'd shared dreams, bills, fears, and hopes, had crossed a line he'd never imagined she would cross. The pain didn't come from the betrayal itself, but from the contempt she'd shown him. As if he didn't exist. As if he were invisible. In the days that followed, Clara didn't return home immediately. She said she needed space. Daniel didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't demand anything. He respected her separation, even though he knew what it meant. The house felt bigger, cold, strange. Every room carried a trace of her, but no sign of her return. And when she finally did, her eyes held no regret, only weariness. The conversation was brief. She said she'd confused her feelings, that she hadn't planned anything, that the moment at the restaurant was just an impulse. Daniel listened to her in silence, as always. But this time, it wasn't silence out of serenity. It was silence out of saturation. Finally. He didn't shout, argue, or beg. He simply went upstairs, took the ring off his finger, and left it on the same table where they had so often placed flowers and enjoyed simple candlelit dinners. That ring now had no meaning. It was no longer a symbol of anything. And the next day, Daniel was gone. Clara remained. She was left with the echo of her choice and the bitter taste of a freedom that arrived without warning, without celebration, without purpose. The man she became involved with, Mateusz, was seductive, well-spoken, the kind of person who made words seem like promises. Clara, weakened by her own dissatisfactions, let herself be carried away. There were no grand plans, no guarantees. Just a moment of desire, of escape, of inflamed ego. But with him, she didn't find the peace Daniel offered. She found euphoria, but not acceptance. She found warmth, but not true affection. And yet, she persisted. She wanted to believe that the mistake was just a consequence of a weary life, that perhaps, in time, the new would transform into stability. Daniel, for his part, took refuge in his work, his books, and his remaining friends. He refused to talk about what had happened, and when questioned, he would only say that some decisions don't deserve justification, only distance. Still, inside him, the pain was constant. Not because of the end of his marriage, but because of the way it all happened. The feeling of having been silently discarded. The lack of dignity in the goodbye that was unspoken, but imposed. Clara slowly began to realize she had traded a story for a fantasy. And that this fantasy had an expiration date. Mateusz was charismatic, but unstable. Interesting, but absent. His charm faded with small gestures. He didn't listen to her, didn't understand her, wasn't interested in the intricacies of her soul. With Daniel, there was care in the silence. With Mateusz, there was noise without depth. The penny began to drop when, one ordinary afternoon, she realized she was alone in a cafe where she usually hung out with Daniel. The place was the same, but the taste of the coffee seemed different. Everything was different. The world moved on, but she seemed frozen in time, trying to rebuild something she had destroyed with her own hands. It was at that moment that the guilt began to take on a voice. A voice and a form. A voice and a weight. And when she tried to get closer to Daniel, he didn't meet her with anger, but with distance. A serene, cutting, definitive distance. Clara cried. She asked for forgiveness. She said she was lost, that she didn't know what she was doing. But Daniel wasn't moved. He simply said that forgiveness exists, but that love dies. And that she had killed something that would not be reborn. But what Clara didn't yet know, was that Mateusz wasn't just a passing memory. He carried with him a past she didn't know about. And that this past would resurface in the most cruel and unexpected way. Something that would transform not only her regret into despair, but would also expose a truth Daniel never imagined he'd hear. And that was yet to come. Clara began to carry her days with the exhaustion of someone tripping over their own reflection. The choice she'd made in the impulse to feel alive now weighed like an invisible chain around her ankles. Her encounters with Mateusz, once charged with forbidden excitement, became empty, routine, predictable. Conversations revolved around him, his plans, his achievements, his desires. Little by little, she realized she wasn't loved there, she was merely a momentary convenience, a trophy ripped from someone else's story. There was no depth, no bond, no effort beyond what he made for himself. The superficiality of the relationship exposed a suffocating absence that no amount of loud music or expensive wine could disguise. Still, she persisted, like someone denying shipwreck until the water reaches their mouth. It was during a vernissage, weeks after her final breakup with Daniel, that everything began to take on irreversible consequences. Clara had been invited by a former co-worker, and upon arriving, she felt the old sense of belonging, the art, the flashes of light, the attentive gazes. But this time, something was different. The smiles were restrained, the hugs shorter, and the conversations superficial. Clara was no longer seen as Daniel's wife, respected and admired for their balance. Now, she was talked about in whispers. All she had to do was look away to catch the whispers. She felt watched, not out of admiration, but out of judgment. And before he could react, an unexpected presence crossed the room. It was her. Lorena. The woman Clara had detested since her youth, a rival with a strong, confident personality who, even effortlessly, radiated an elegance that seemed to belie the judgments Clara had always made about her. Lorena appeared smiling, strutting among the guests, her glow going beyond her jewelry. Clara's eyes widened when she saw Mateusz appear right behind her, his hand resting on Lorena's waist as if he'd always belonged there. He looked different, more groomed, more at ease, laughing like he hadn't in ages. When Clara's eyes met his, a faint smile spread across her face. It wasn't a smile of shame, nor of guilt. It was the kind of smile that hurts, the one that confirms, without words, that you never had any intention of staying. She looked away, but it was too late. Lorena had already seen her. She approached unhurriedly, a glass of sparkling wine in her hand, her dress marking each confident step. She stopped in front of Clara with the same naturalness of someone greeting an old friend and, in a sweet, cutting voice, said, "What a surprise to see you here. I thought you weren't much into these kinds of events lately." Clara kept her face straight, but her dry throat betrayed her discomfort. She murmured something like, "Art has always attracted me," trying to maintain her composure. Mateusz, beside Lorena, smiled again, as if watching a well-rehearsed scene. "Clara and I have met before, haven't we, Mateusz?" Lorena added, touching his arm intimately. He simply nodded and looked at Clara indifferently, as if she were just another name on his list. That night, Clara didn't finish her wine, didn't say goodbye to anyone, and left early. The cold outside bit her skin, but what really hurt was inside. It wasn't just that Mateusz had left. It was that she had chosen, of all places, Lorena, the woman who had always embodied, for Clara, everything she claimed to despise, but deep down always envied. Lorena was her opposite in almost every way, where Clara was intensity and haste, Lorena was subtlety and dominance. Clara needed to be seen, Lorena knew how to be noticed quietly. The feeling of being replaced by her corroded her like acid, not because of the loss of Mateusz, but because of what it represented. The next morning, Clara tried to contact Mateusz. She called and texted, to no avail. Hours later, she received only a curt reply, "I have nothing more to offer you. I hope you find what you're looking for." Her heart sank. For days, she alternated between anger and humiliation. She tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence, that Mateusz and Lorena had met again by chance, that everything would pass. But social media doesn't lie, and there they were, side by side, at dinners, on trips, at events. The comments were complimentary, the likes were multiplying, and among the photos, there was a specific caption that hurt more than any silence: "Sometimes the universe rewards you when you stop insisting in the wrong place." It was this sentence that tore the veil of denial. Clara finally understood that, besides losing Daniel, she had placed herself in a position where she was now remembered not for the woman she was, but for the choices she made. The social circle that had once applauded her now looked at her with a kind of disguised pity. She had become an example of what not to do, what not to repeat. And yet, she decided to seek out Daniel. Perhaps out of regret, perhaps in a desperate attempt to be heard one last time by someone who knew her without masks. Daniel greeted her with the same politeness as always. He was different, no longer dejected, no longer hurt. There was an unsettling peace in his gaze. Clara felt, upon seeing him, that he was no longer hers, not even in her thoughts. He offered her a coffee and waited in silence while she rehearsed her words. He said he missed what they had, that he knew he had made a mistake, that he now saw clearly how much he had deluded himself. Daniel listened, but he didn't smile, didn't interrupt, didn't get emotional. When she finished, there was a long silence, until he said, his voice firm, "You chose to leave. And that's okay. But don't expect me to wait for someone who has already left me behind." She persisted, asking if he felt anything, anything at all. And he replied, "Yes, I do. I feel relief at having escaped a love that depended on distractions to survive. I deserve more." Clara wept. Not with the desperation of someone who wants to return, but with the desperation of someone who understands there is no going back. He stood up, thanked her for visiting, and, before opening the door, added, "I forgive you, Clara. But forgiveness is a full stop. It's not reticence." That night, Clara returned home and lay down on a cold bed in an empty room, certain that nothing was left. Not Daniel. Not Mateus. Not even the image she had of herself. All that remained was the echo of her choices, and the weight of what is lost when one plays with what is true. But there was still something Clara didn't know, something that would turn her humiliation into despair. Something that would make her rethink not only what she'd experienced with Mateus, but what she'd never known about him. And how it would be revealed, would change everything. Clara didn't know what she was doing there, standing in front of the window of that coffee shop, looking inside as if waiting for something that no longer exists. The fogged glass reflected her tired face, her dull eyes, the visage of the woman she had become, a shadow of what she once was. Behind the counter, a waitress smiled at a young couple laughing loudly, fingers intertwined, sharing a cappuccino with whipped cream as if time were no threat. Clara looked away and clutched her purse to her body, as if that gesture could protect her from everything she felt. She needed to breathe. She needed to understand how she had allowed her life to turn into that succession of ruins. It was no longer about Mateus, nor about Daniel. It was about her. About the void she had tried to fill with noise, with desires, with a freedom that turned out to be a prison. The next day, she woke up early and decided not to turn on her phone. He couldn't bear to see the images that appeared on his feed with cruel frequency. Lorena and Mateus were now something of a hot couple in certain social circles. Beautiful, well-dressed, always in expensive places, always smiling. The cruel irony was that Clara had, for so long, felt superior to Lorena, as if her authenticity and intensity were marks of a more real love. But now, all he saw was her brilliance overshadowing his name in every space where Clara had previously been remembered. It was as if she had been erased, replaced, forgotten, and most painfully, by someone she had arrogantly despised for years. That same week, she decided to accept an invitation to a smaller cultural event, something more low-key, where she might reconnect with her field, her essence, or anything that made her feel alive again. When she arrived, an old college friend greeted her enthusiastically, but with a slight hint of surprise, as if she hadn't expected to see her there anymore. "I thought you distanced yourself from everything, after, well, you know," the woman said, trying to soften the sentence, but to no avail. Clara smiled weakly, as if accepting a slap disguised as kindness. She pretended not to care, moved on, and for a few moments, believed that perhaps she might finally be able to reconnect. But it was when Lorena's name was announced as guest curator for the next event of the foundation sponsoring the space that something inside Clara snapped. The applause came quickly, warmly. Clara didn't know it, but Lorena had taken the place previously reserved for her behind the scenes of art, in cultural projects, in the opinion circles. And, as if that weren't enough, the speech ended with the unexpected presence of Mateus beside her on stage. He didn't even look at her. Clara left without saying a word, feeling herself disintegrating with each step. The next morning, the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. She answered on the second ring. On the other end, a voice she recognized immediately, Camila, one of the few friends she still kept in touch with, though more distant lately. "Clara, I know you don't want to hear from him anymore, but I need to tell you something." "And you'll thank me later," she said hesitantly. Clara fell silent, and Camila continued. "Did you know that Lorena and Mateus have been involved for years? Even before you met him? It wasn't a coincidence, Clara. She knew exactly who he was when she brought him back. It wasn't a coincidence." The silence on the other end of the line was deeper than any answer. Clara swallowed hard, as if trying to digest something impossible. Camila continued, this time more firmly, "They worked together years ago, remember? Lorena knew everything about your life. She knew about Daniel, she knew about your crisis, the separation. And when she found out you were involved with Mateus, she approached him. And he pursued her. Because she promised him space, visibility, the place he always wanted at events, behind the scenes. You were just the shortcut." Clara felt the ground give way beneath her feet. The betrayal now took on new layers, more perverse, colder. It wasn't just a failed romance. It was manipulation. Of being used by both. Of being deceived by two faces she knew, one out of desire, the other out of rivalry. She was merely the link between two parallel ambitions. Mateus wanted space. Lorena wanted revenge. And Clara handed everything over to them, thinking she was in control. That afternoon, she tried to write. She'd always believed words could be a refuge. But she couldn't. What once flowed easily now seemed suffocated by pain. That's when, on impulse, she wrote a letter to Daniel. Not to get back together. Not to ask for anything. Just to tell him. To share with him, not out of hope, but out of necessity. Because he'd been the only one who knew her without a filter, without artifice. And because, deep down, I still carried the weight of not having been honest enough. Days later, Daniel responded. A single line, "Time always reveals what words hide. I hope you find peace." Nothing more. No anger. No consolation. No open door. It was final. Clara then understood that forgiveness is not a return, it is a full stop given by those who have learned to walk alone. Over time, social events dwindled. Messages became rare. Mateus and Lorena were seen less frequently. The spotlight shifted, as it always does. And Clara stood there, holding her own story in her hands, shattered but aware. The loss was now real. Not just of love, but of the image she had of herself. There was no blaming Daniel, or Mateus, or Lorena. The choice was hers. The betrayal was hers. And life simply returned, with precision, each thoughtless action. From then on, Clara began rebuilding herself in silence. She began therapy. She moved house. She disconnected from her old groups, from friendships of convenience. She relearned how to walk alone, how to listen to herself. There was no immediate consolation, no ready-made happy endings. But there was room for a fresh start. A fresh start away from old names, away from false promises, away from impulsive decisions. And Daniel? He changed too. He met someone with whom he began to share his life. Someone who listened to him, who didn't need to run away to find himself. Someone who loved him with the calmness Clara never managed to cultivate. There was no rush, no euphoria. Just the tranquility of a love that blossoms without a shout, but endures even in silence. The new woman in Daniel's life didn't know his past in detail, but she knew how to recognize a man who had learned to value his peace. Years later, Clara and Daniel crossed paths by chance in a bookstore. It was brief. Cordial. Mature. She smiled, and so did he. There was no emotion, no rancor. Just the recognition of two people who had once shared the same home, the same roof, but now walked in opposite directions with the dignity of those who finally understood. Not every story needs a reunion to have meaning. Some serve only to teach the value of what is lost when one doesn't know how to care for it. But the memory of it all still echoed. And sometimes, when Clara woke in the middle of the night, she could still taste the bitter taste of the wrong choice. A taste no glass of wine could ever erase. That brief exchange of glances in the bookstore lingered in Clara's mind for days. It wasn't the reunion itself that unsettled her, but the naturalness with which it happened. Daniel didn't look away, didn't pretend he didn't see her, didn't avoid contact. He looked at her serenely, with a slight smile, without any tension on his face. And that hurt more than any scream, any resentment. The weightlessness in his gaze made it clear she no longer occupied any space within him. Clara, who had fantasized for so long that perhaps a part of Daniel still existed, waiting for her, was now faced with the harshest reality: he had healed, he had moved on. And she was no longer part of any plan, not even his fond memory. Everything they had shared was buried in peace. She, on the other hand, carried a still throbbing scar. Not from lost love, but from the full knowledge that she had wrested with her own hands what she most sought now: stability, trust, true love. Clara plunged into an introspective phase, avoiding social engagements, declining invitations, and even distancing herself from the few friends she had left. She didn't want advice, nor words of support. She couldn't stand hearing that everything would be resolved with time. Because she knew, time doesn't solve the problem, time only teaches us to live with what can no longer be fixed. Each day dawned with the weight of what could have been different if she had listened to her own silences instead of letting herself be carried away by the external noise. She tried to occupy herself with classes, reading, and long walks, but there were moments when her mind simply took her back to the small scenes that now seemed crucial: the way Daniel would wait for her with hot coffee on cold nights, the times he would listen to her unhurriedly even when he was tired, the hugs that seemed to promise that everything would be okay, even when there was no certainty. At the time, all of that seemed ordinary. Today, it seemed like gold. While Clara tried to pick up the pieces of herself, Daniel lived a different reality. The relationship with his new partner had strengthened over time, but in a different way than it had with Clara. There was no longer that impulsive surrender, nor the fairy tale expectations. There was maturity. There was mutual respect and a construction based on conscious choices, not idealized promises. The woman by his side was calm, yet intense in her own way. She didn't demand, she didn't press, but she was present, attentive, available. Daniel, after all, had learned that love is also knowing how to stop insisting where you bleed, and start over where you are welcomed. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but about not letting it determine your next steps. And it was precisely this contrast between the two worlds that began to haunt Clara more intensely. The more Daniel blossomed, the deeper she sank into her own decisions. And the moral dilemma that began to grow within her was no longer about having lost him, but about having hurt someone who had done her nothing but good. Her regret now took on deeper, crueler forms. It was no longer that selfish feeling of wanting to go back in time to fix what had hurt her. It was the recognition that she had hurt someone who deserved to be protected. And it ate away at her. She began writing letters she never sent. Pages and pages where she tried in vain to explain to herself how she had allowed everything to happen. Sometimes she would sit on the couch and review old photos hidden in digital folders, searching for signs that their love had already ended before the betrayal. But she found none. The sparkle in his eyes, the daily gestures of care, the simple trips, the late afternoons embraced on the balcony, nothing pointed to an end. Daniel's love hadn't failed. She was the one who gave up before trying to fix it. And now there was no room for repair. It was in this vulnerable state that Clara began to hear whispers of a possible separation between Lorena and Mateus. News that trickled through the edges, in brief conversations, in ambiguous publications. Lorena, it seemed, was no longer trying to hide her disinterest. Mateus, for his part, seemed irritated, out of place, as if he hadn't expected to be discarded so soon. Clara watched from afar, without celebration, without relief. If before she might have felt a kind of poetic justice, now it all seemed irrelevant. The damage was already done. Nothing that happened to them would be able to undo what she had caused. Still, there was a kind of uneasiness that kept her awake. One afternoon, when running into an old classmate who also lived with Lorena, Clara heard more than she wanted. Between loose phrases and uncomfortable laughter, he commented that Lorena had never forgotten an old resentment, a silent rivalry she'd harbored since university. She never could stand knowing you were so loved, even though you were so unstable. You always effortlessly drew attention. I think she just needed a reason to retaliate, he said, unaware of the impact of his words. Clara felt her throat tighten. For the first time, she understood that she had been the target not just of dislike, but of a game of vanity and other people's ego. Lorena didn't want Mateus, she wanted to see her fall. And she succeeded. At the end of that day, Clara walked to the old building where she lived with Daniel. He stood across the street, staring at the facade for long minutes. The lights were on, the white curtains fluttering in the breeze, the distant smell of a neighbor's dinner. Everything looked the same, yet everything was irrevocably different. It was like looking at a life that no longer belonged to him. And perhaps would never belong to anyone else in the same way again. She knew there was no easy redemption. No comeback would restore what had been lost. The damage was permanent. But there was still one final choice to be made. Move forward or lose yourself forever. Keep looking back or begin, once and for all, to build something new from the pain. Not for the hope of recovering the past, but for dignity. Because even those who make mistakes deserve to rise again, as long as they understand the weight of their own fall. That night, Clara wrote a final letter. Not to send. But to record. For the first time, he wasn't trying to justify himself. He simply recounted, honestly, everything he'd experienced. The motivations she didn't even understand, the emptiness she tried to hide, the impulses that dominated her, the losses she deserved. And at the end of the letter, a sentence, I learned, too late, that love requires courage. And I was a coward. He folded the paper carefully, put it in a drawer, and closed his eyes. The dilemma now was no longer between going back or moving on. It was between living with dignity or continuing to wallow in regret. And she knew, somewhere deep inside, that she could still rebuild a life, not with Daniel, not with Mateus, not with anyone from her past. But with herself. Still, there was something inside her that resisted. A silent fear of never being seen as truthful again. Of never again encountering a clear gaze, like Daniel's, that could see the best in her, despite her mistakes. And time, which had previously seemed like an enemy, now became the only chance for redemption. But there was a price. And she was willing to pay it. Even if the world would never forgive her. Because, finally, she was beginning to understand, betrayal isn't just about deceiving the other person. It's about losing yourself. And she needed, more than anything, to find herself again. The days that followed writing that last letter were strangely still. Clara didn't leave the house for a while. She turned off notifications, cancelled appointments, ignored invitations she didn't even read to the end. Not out of pride or acute sadness, but out of exhaustion. She was, finally, reaching the depths of silence, the one where the pain no longer screams, only weighs. The one where there's no hope of returning, no courage to move on. Everything about her seemed suspended. She didn't cry, didn't smile, didn't hate. She simply existed. It was the rawest stage of regret, the one where the conscience is fully awake, but the body still doesn't know how to move again. It wasn't about Mateus, Lorena, or Daniel anymore. They were all out of reach now, each living the consequences of their own decisions. What was left was her. And she, for the first time, was willing to look at herself without looking away. It was during this period that Clara chanced upon Julia, an old acquaintance, one of those people who pass through life in brief chapters, but who, for some reason, leave a mark. They crossed paths in a small bookstore on a rainy late afternoon. Julia seemed the same, discreet, with an attentive gaze that penetrated her banal words. After a shy greeting, they headed to a nearby cafe, and it was the first time in months that Clara allowed herself to genuinely talk to someone. She spoke little at first, but over time, she let out fragments of the truth. Julia didn't judge. She didn't offer pre-packaged advice. She simply listened respectfully, and in the end, she said something that would long echo in Clara's mind: "You've been through an internal war, Clara. But instead of fighting for yourself, you handed over all your weapons to others. Now, it's time to stop bleeding over old decisions and start healing the wounds that remain." After that encounter, something inside Clara began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but steadily. She began accepting small jobs, simple invitations, reconnecting with parts of herself she had left dormant. She avoided her old circles, but little by little, she allowed new people to come closer. She discovered, day after day, that there was still beauty in starting over, even without guarantees, even without certainties. It still hurt to remember everything she had lost, but the pain was no longer paralyzing. It was just part of the process. The loneliness, once desperate, now served as fertile ground for reflection. For the first time, Clara began writing not about what she felt, but about what she wanted to build from the pain. It was also during this period that Daniel, ironically, had to return to one of the cultural spaces where Clara now worked part-time. It was a low-key event, curated by a new generation, where he had been invited to participate in a panel on art investment. Clara was there, not as a protagonist, but as part of the support team. When she saw him arrive, she felt a chill run down her spine, but took a deep breath and decided not to hide. Not anymore. Daniel saw her almost immediately. They exchanged a cordial, respectful wave, and she returned it with a slight smile. Nothing forced, nothing dramatic. For the first time, they looked at each other as two adults who had lived through something great, who had destroyed themselves in silence, but who now knew how to respect the space between past and present. At the end of the event, Daniel passed by her again, this time closer. Clara, surprising herself, made a simple comment about the panel. He responded with interest. And what followed was a brief conversation, concise, mature, without subtext. Neither of them mentioned the past. Neither mentioned any hard feelings. It was as if, there, in that dimly lit corridor of a small gallery, they sealed a silent pact of mutual respect. Clara realized, with a strange pang in her chest, that he was truly fine. His presence was light, his gaze steady. He was with someone else, she knew that, but there was no ostentation in his demeanor. Just the serenity of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. That night, alone at home, Clara wrote another letter. Not to Daniel, not to Mateus, not to anyone. A letter to herself. A kind of internal contract, a commitment to the new version of herself she was trying to build. There, she promised not to sabotage herself anymore, not to chase temporary validation, not to silence her intuition for fear of losing something. She decided, finally, to leave the past where it deserved, closed. Not as something to be forgotten, but as something that no longer needed to be relived every day. Months passed. Mateus's social media became quieter. The posts with Lorena disappeared, as did the invitations to popular events. She herself seemed to have withdrawn from the spotlight. The two, it seemed, had gone their separate, and discreet, ways. Clara no longer sought to know. What had once been a source of obsession now seemed distant, irrelevant. What mattered now was the relationship she was beginning to build with herself. A relationship unhurried, unmasked, without the need for an audience. Daniel, for his part, was consolidating his new life with firm steps. The woman who now accompanied him was a companion in essence, an accomplice in the little things, a constant and affectionate presence. There were no comparisons with the past. There was peace. There was reciprocity. They both lived with their feet on the ground and their eyes on the same horizon. Clara was no longer part of that future, but somehow, it no longer hurt as it once did. Because she finally understood that certain losses are deliverances. Not because the person you lose was bad, but because the moment you lived with them was no longer compatible with who you are becoming. On an autumn Sunday, Clara walked through a park near her new neighborhood. Dry leaves covered the ground, and the overcast sky threatened rain. There were children playing, couples strolling, and elderly people reading on wooden benches. She sat alone, took a book from her bag, and began to read. A young woman nearby, distracted by her dog, commented on the unstable weather. They both laughed. That was all. But there, in that ordinary moment, Clara felt part of the world again. Not as a supporting character in a drama, but as the author of a new narrative. She still didn't know how the story would end. But for the first time in a long time, she was willing to write the next chapters calmly, truthfully, and responsibly. And maybe, just maybe, that would be a start. Months turned into years, and over time, the distance between what was and what is became more than geographic, it became emotional, spiritual, vital. Clara, despite the painful process, had finally found a resting place within herself. It wasn't complete happiness or euphoria over new achievements. It was something quieter and, at the same time, more genuine, the serenity of someone who survived her own destruction and chose to rebuild herself brick by brick, without haste, without spectacle, without expectation of recognition. She began to live a simpler, more intimate life, prioritizing silence over noise and depth over distractions. She rekindled occasional relationships with people who respected the new space she occupied, but she never again returned to being the woman who screamed to be seen. What existed within her now was a more mature, more careful, more sober presence. One late spring afternoon, Clara received an unmarked manila envelope. Inside was an invitation to an art exhibition at a small gallery, the same one she had helped redesign some time ago. On the list of curators, her name appeared alongside two others, as a collaborator on the project. It was the first time in a long time that her work would be publicly exhibited again, with a signature. She hesitated, but decided to go. She arrived punctually, without attracting attention. And upon entering, she saw that among the works on display was a series of paintings with fragments of letters pasted under white paint, almost faded letters, overlapping words, stains, visible silences. It was her work. It was her story transformed into art. Visitors stopped before the pieces, unaware of who had written them. But there, in those smudges and hidden words, was the portrait of a soul lost, betrayed, imploded, and then tried, with her own hands, to pick up the pieces and make sense of what was left. In another part of the city, Daniel was drinking coffee with his partner, now his wife. They had just left the adoption hearing for the boy they had been following for months in a silent and loving process. He was an 8-year-old boy, smart and sensitive, who had connected with Daniel in an almost inexplicable way. The boy called him Dad even before the sentencing, and Daniel's new wife had become a safe haven, a home. Daniel now knew that life doesn't reward precisely, but that sometimes it gives a second chance to those who haven't lost the ability to love honestly. He didn't talk about Clara, nor did he hold grudges. He had left everything in the past. The pain he felt was real, deep, but transformed. He no longer needed to remember to learn. He had already learned. Mateus, for his part, continued in a confusing and constant cycle of reinvention. After his breakup with Lorena, he plunged into other shallow relationships, all marked by repetition, initial charm, mutual interest, dry breakups. He tried to maintain the appearance of success, but behind the scenes, there was no longer as much prestige as before. The lack of solid connections began to erode his image. People began to avoid him, invitations became rare, influential figures stopped including him in decisions. The kind of reputation built through seduction and opportunism is short-lived, and he learned this the hard way, alone. He even had a few outbursts to reconnect with Clara, with ambiguous messages and hinted reunions, but she never responded. He realized then that he had been erased. Not out of revenge, but out of irrelevance. Lorena, in turn, went further than Mateus, but also fell more quietly. After reaching her peak in social and cultural circles, she saw her reputation eroded by authoritarian attitudes and self-serving alliances. Many began to question her behind-the-scenes conduct, projects began to be revised, funding was cancelled. She tried to stay on top, but without sincere allies, it was only a matter of time before she was pushed aside by a new generation with different ideas, more empathy, and less arrogance. Her rise, built on the destruction of others, found no solid ground when it was her turn to be called to account. Today, Lorena maintains a low profile, trying to rebuild herself in smaller circles, without her former brilliance, but with the same wounded vanity. On a rainy Sunday, Clara met Julia again for a calm lunch. Between simple dishes and quiet laughter, she spoke for the first time without pain about what she had experienced. She said she didn't want to erase anything, not even the darkest moments. Because each mistake showed her exactly who she didn't want to be. She said she had learned to respect the pain of others as part of self-love. And Julia, with the wisdom of someone who listens to the world in silence, replied, "That's it. You finally stopped chasing after yourself." Clara smiled, and in that smile there was something different, a peace that didn't come from having everything figured out, but from knowing, finally, that one can live well even without having all the answers. Years later, Clara became a mentor for a project that offered writing workshops for women in the process of starting over. Every story she read, every account she received, reconnected her with her own pain, but also with her strength. She never told her story publicly. She preferred to let the words speak through other voices. But everyone who knew her sensed there was something of a survivor in her, something of someone who had been to hell and back with hands full of meaning. And Daniel? He watched his son's first recital with tears in his eyes. The boy played a simple song on the piano, but the pride that welled up in Daniel's chest was impossible to contain. At the end, the boy ran to him and threw himself into his arms with a phrase that remained in his memory like a seal on everything he had experienced up until that point, "Dad, I did it for you." And Daniel replied, his voice breaking, "And I, for you, son." Their story didn't end with improbable twists, forced endings, or illusory reconciliations. It ended as life ends for those who choose to move forward with dignity, with new paths, new bonds, new meanings. And with the certainty that losses make room for what truly matters to arrive. It's not about erasing the past, but about freeing oneself from it. Clara learned this. Daniel knew this from the beginning. And everyone else reaped what they sowed, sooner or later. Now, tell me, what did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced something similar or know someone who has? Leave your opinion in the comments, we want to know what this story resonated with you. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Here, every week, you'll find impactful stories, based on real feelings, with lessons that touch your heart. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys trust, kills bonds, erases good memories, and plants doubts that sometimes never disappear. No one emerges unscathed. No one loves the same after being betrayed. This channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Our purpose is to show the real consequences of hurtful choices and to inspire, through pain, a new way of loving. Until the next story. May it not be born of pain, but of care.